I am obsessed with money. Specifically the people on it. It's the way they surround us. They're always staring at us, judging us for our 7-Eleven purchases, enduring the street magic of our buskers, getting thrown in our faces. It actually makes me feel kind of guilty. The people on our banknotes are like most of my cousins. I really should know all of their names by now, but somehow I don't. You could also say they're like the contestants on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, because I have absolutely no idea why they're famous. And I started wondering, is that weird? That we're carrying around these faces with us every single day and we don't even know who they belong to? I mean, for comparison, take a look at the USA. The greenbacks are maybe the most recognizable pieces of paper in the world, or in history even. And as a result, I think most Australians could name more of these faces than they could the people on our own banknotes. Unlike our currency, the greenbacks depict a succession of old white men, all of them presidents or founding fathers, all looking solemn, contemplative, borderline grim, a bit perturbed, a lot like the dads of One Direction. If you go over to the EU, you get the total opposite. The Euro banknotes have no people on them at all. Not only do they not have people on them, but none of the buildings on them even exist. The notes all feature purely imaginary bridges and gateways. I bring up these examples because banknotes are a form of political communication, designed to send specific messages. The American dollar is designed to evoke feelings of nationalism, authority, and permanence. The euro is meant to conjure up feelings of pan-European cultural identity, so it can bind together people from a whole lot of different countries, cultures, and language groups without appearing to play favourites with any particular one. And all money, above all, regardless of the country, regardless of the denomination, needs to convince people, subconsciously, that it has value. That is its prime directive, to sell the idea that a piece of paper is inherently worth food. Back in the early colonial days, we didn't have an Australian dollar. Instead, there were two kinds of cash circulating the land. The British pound sterling, which was the official medium of exchange, and everything else. Foreign dollars that were picked up from trading ships, IOU notes, bottles of rum. The everything else category was dismissively known as currency. Unlike the official coins of the pound sterling, which were shipped from Britain, the hodgepodge collection of currency was scraped together on island. It was of lesser value and had a lack of legitimacy. These two terms, sterling and currency, were soon used to describe different types of Australians. The emigrants from Britain were known as pound sterling, as robust and pure as the motherland they came from. But people born in Australia were called currency lads or currency lasses because they were made of lesser stuff. But just like real money, the value of the pound sterling immigrants and the local currency lads changed over time. The currency lads and lasses became the first generation of colonists to take pride in being born in a remote, ill-equipped outpost on the other side of the world from Britain. The first of the post-invasion colonialists to really consider themselves Australian. In this series, I'm going to go through our banknotes, from the $5 all the way up to the $100, with some pretty major detours along the way. Who's on our banknotes? What did they do? Why haven't they made it into our cultural vernacular like money has in other countries? You know, in England, cokeheads who tear their nostrils to shreds by snorting with a rolled-up plastic £5 note call it getting Winstoned. Australia invented plastic banknotes, but no manic stockbrokers are barging into Port Melbourne doctors' clinics with a polo shirt over their bleeding faces, ranting about getting Elizabeth II'd. How do we make it sound cool when we bribe people?
Well, that's not what a friend of mine told me. Maybe you know him. His name is Abraham.
Perhaps you should talk to my good friend, a building. I mean, yeah, sure, everyone knows who Queen Elizabeth is, and, you know, maybe you can also name Banjo Patterson. But you might not have known that our $10 note has basically been like a Brunswick share house. Everyone who's been on the $10 note was either a poet or a bankrupt artist, most of them were socialists, and two of them ended up hooking up with each other. You might not know about the man on the $50 note, who was known as the Australian Da Vinci, or Mary Reeby, a business magnate who was shipped to Australia for stealing a horse and was later charged with assaulting a debtor. You know, I love the fact that we put someone on a banknote after they beat the shit out of someone who owed them money. I hope her face was on the $20 note when he paid her back. That'll teach him. There is a reason why you might not know who was on our banknotes. Unless you're the guy that Mary Ryby beat up, and you can't withdraw money from an ATM because her face coming out at you causes you to start screaming uncontrollably in 7-Eleven. Unless you're that guy, you probably absorb the faces on our money subconsciously. That's intentional. It's a form of what's called banal nationalism. Repetitious, everyday symbols or concepts that build a shared national identity. And while banal nationalism includes things like songs, icons, statues, turns of phrase, TV shows, I think there's something about money that cuts even deeper into our psyche. Our brains are hardwired to see human faces. We start looking for faces and responding to them within hours of being born. We're also hardwired, to a degree, to trust human faces, or at least to make instant trust judgments based on people's faces. And I think this plays into how we perceive banknotes. Putting faces on banknotes taps into something deep in our heads, and it's not always a force that's easy to control. Take the 1954 Canadian $1 notes, which had to be withdrawn from circulation because people saw a face where there wasn't meant to be one. A grinning demon in the hair of the Queen with pouchy eyes, hooked nose, flared nostrils, and thick, loose lips. I can't really see it, but I'm not surprised that others did. There's something a little bit mysterious and ineffable about banknotes. I think we expect them to have secrets. Dark secrets. They hold so much power over us, so it kind of makes sense that rather than being effectively the same as Monopoly money, they'd instead be encoded with subliminal malevolent messages, demonic enchantments, calling cards for secret societies, instructions for how to do a 9/11. In the first Gulf War, the one that only lasted a couple of months, the USA dropped 29 million propaganda leaflets over Iraq. There was one particular piece of propaganda that caught my attention. On one side of the leaflet, it looked exactly like an Iraqi banknote. Same size, same shape, same portrait of the business suit wearing Saddam Hussein. On the other side of the propaganda leaflet was a message that translated to, "There is no difference between your money and this piece of paper." Kind of a philosophical piece of propaganda, really, and kind of accurate for any currency when you get right down to it. But when America invaded Iraq again, and took over running the country, they once again found themselves printing Iraqi currency. Only this time they were printing it for real. Despite once declaring on their propaganda leaflets that the Iraqi dinar was just as disposable and meaningless as a random piece of paper, for months after the invasion in 2003, they found they had to keep printing the money, complete with that same big portrait of Saddam Hussein. They kicked him out of his palace, they pulled down his statue, but they couldn't oust him from the paper money. I guess despite his toppling, Saddam's face still made money feel like money. It's a trustworthy face. This brings me to a weird thing about paper money, kind of like a banknote rule of etiquette. If you put a living person on it, if a country puts a living person on it, then we tend to see that living person as a dictator, like Saddam Hussein, and we associate it with tyrannies. Power-mad egomaniacs who just want to see their face plastered everywhere. The first living Roman leader to mint his image onto coins was Julius Caesar. After a triumphant return to the capital, he commissioned a coin featuring his portrait and the title, Dictator for Life. Weeks later, as the coins were being minted, he was assassinated in the Senate. After the War of American Independence, George Washington emphatically refused to put himself on the new currency of the USA. He thought it was a tyrannical aesthetic. The archetypal 20th century tyrant, Adolf Hitler, never pierced the borders of the German Reichsmark. His portrait was nowhere to be found. The one exception to this rule is Queen Elizabeth II, who is actually on the most banknotes in the entire world. With that said, let's finally move into Australia's $5 note. Honestly, my enthusiasm for doing this series was kind of weighed down by this one. Starting off with the $5 kind of sucks. It's a bit of a handicap. It's like how whenever I play Mario Kart, I always screw up pressing the accelerator at the right time during the countdown, and then the car backfires and spins out while Toad and Peach roar off into the horizon. The $5 note is definitely a slow start. It's a most boring note and the least Australian. On the one side, you've got Queen Elizabeth II, who, as I said, pops up on international currency like Stanley and comic book movies. And on the other side, you've got the new Parliament House, and, that's in Canberra, so not much to talk about. But I think there is some mileage in talking about how this banknote, our $5 one, sums up our weird cultural relationship with England. The $5 note is our only current paper bill that connects us to the motherland. Like the small Union Jack on our flag, or the R in front of all our good acronyms, it's just a little taste of the monarchy, a little reminder of our status as subjects of the Queen, a little tug on that trans-Pacific umbilical cord. It's a delicate dance keeping the monarchy in Australia visible without rubbing it in our collective face, and it's really hard to get right. But because banknotes, as I said before, are intended to be absorbed, by and large, subconsciously, it's a really handy vehicle to stick some royal imagery on. But that doesn't mean it hasn't burnt some politicians along the way. Look at our old Prime Minister, Harold Holt. Insofar as he's actually remembered, it's for vanishing into the ocean. But he did have a life before he went to wherever it was he went to.
And then I'll tell you everything you need to know about protecting this island, because by the time that fire burns out, one of you is going to have to start doing it.
Harold Holt was the treasurer in the Menzies government, and so it was his responsibility to manage the transition from our old imperial pound sterling money system to decimal currency. By and large, the Australian public accepted the fact that it was probably a good thing to move from the weird, dumb system of pounds, shillings, pence, halfpennies, which is all based on a system developed in the 8th century, to something that was based on the metric system, like we have now.
In come the dollars, in come the cents, to replace the pounds and the shillings and the pence. Be prepared, folks, when the coins begin to mix on the 14th of February 1966. Who are you?
The conversion promised to save the Australian economy about £11 million a year, with day-to-day efficiency gains and making it 22% faster to add money and 43% faster to multiply money, which was a bigger deal when you didn't have calculators in your pocket, but still very useful. But then the government was faced with another decision, seemingly a less significant decision, but ended up being far more controversial. And that's, what do you call your new currency? We're getting rid of pounds, shillings, and pence, but we need a new name.
Call it, yes.
So in 1963, they held a national competition to name the new currency unit. These were some of the suggestions I found in news reports. So think of these as alternatives instead of the Australian dollar. We could have had
For a whole lot. Just call it
the pound, the crown, the sovereign, the regal, these ones are pretty standard. Then there was the emu, the roo, kanga, kangaroo, jumbuck, galah, brumby. You know what? Pretty much every Australian animal was suggested as a currency name, even the lame ones, so just feel free to list those to yourself in your own time. Here's some more suggestions. The champ, the desi mate, baba, the bonza, the dollaroo, the banjo, the cooey, the inflato, noodle, dad. Yes, at least one person wanted us to call our currency Dad. So apart from using existing currency names like dollar or pound, the search for a unique currency name pretty much came down to the Oster or the Austral or some variation of that. But after all of that weird Freudian brainstorming, Robert Menzies just decided that our new currency would be called the Australian Royal.
Well done.
Now, just for context, Robert Menzies had maybe a bigger hard-on for the British monarchy than even Tony Abbott. Earlier that year, he had become the second sitting Australian Prime Minister to be knighted, so I guess he wanted to make sure that our move away from the pound and shilling wasn't too much of a departure from Britain. So he gave it to Harold Holt, and Harold Holt announced the name to the public, and the reaction was poor. It was kind of like the reaction to Tony Abbott when he knighted Prince Philip, but with more death threats. One poll said that only 13% of Australians were for the name, while letters to the editor and newspapers said that the Australian Royal was disgusting and an insult to the Australian people. The death threats, for some reason, or at least the ones that I found that were reported on, were sent to Harold Holt's wife. Here's a couple of them. One read, "Next time, the hoax will not be a hoax, and it will be the very real thing if you do not try and persuade your husband, Mr. Harold Holt, to change the name of our new decimal currency to something more topical than royal. Sincerely yours, from 25 very loyal Australians." Another one was less polite. It just said, "Mrs. Holt, your ignorant, arrogant husband will leave you a widow in the near future." Holt and Menzies were forced to beat a hasty retreat from the Royal, which is how we ended up with the Australian dollar. So finding the right place for the royal family in Australia, it's a delicate operation. It's hard. The English don't need to remind themselves that they're English. They just look out the window. But on the other side of the world, it's a different story. Writing in 1901 about the death of Queen Victoria, Australian author W.H. Fitchett wrote, "The death of the Queen cast on the Empire a shadow like the blackness of an eclipse, and nowhere was that shadow darker than in Australasia." In 1867, Australia had its first royal tour when the second in line for the throne, Prince Alfred, came to visit. And before his visit, there was a bit of a movement generated. There was a pamphlet circulated, a newspaper column published, saying that he should actually stay in Australia and start a new royal family and become the King of Australia. But then when he got to Australia, a guy shot him in the butt. So there's a bit of a push-pull with the royals, is what I'm trying to say. When we're trying to show England and the royal family how much we love them, it can easily get very awkward.
All right. Could I just have one glass of water, please? No. I'm terribly sorry about this.
Yeah, don't worry. It happens everywhere.
Doesn't?
Absolutely. But you don't have one of these teleprompters?
No, not
You
here.
don't?
Australia is like a dog with separation anxiety, and the scraps of royal attention we get are kind of like the dirty socks and underpants that we steal and hoard. Bringing it back to banknotes, maybe this is why Queen Elizabeth II was featured on Australian money before she was featured on English money. We started including her on our banknotes in 1953, but Britain only put her on a banknote in 1960, and she was the first reigning monarch to actually appear on a British banknote. So many countries other than England have put Elizabeth II on their banknotes over the years that you can assemble a kind of multi-denominational, multinational flipbook of her aging. Apart from being excellent concept art for a new Animorphs series, it also makes a good slideshow of how portraits on banknotes have changed over time. From smaller, more contained faces to larger, more smiley faces that blend into the note and look right at you. Queen Elizabeth II is the world's longest reigning monarch, and her reign has encompassed some immense changes and immense shifts in the power and function of the British Empire and the British monarchy. I'm not saying it's a one-to-one relationship that means the older she gets, the weaker the might of the empire, but it's not too far off. So given the huge amount of portraits available of the Queen at various stages in her life, looking at the portraits and the period that they represent on various banknotes is an interesting activity. The British use a portrait of the Queen, for example, that looks like she's barely aged from the banknote they issued in the 1960s. I guess banknotes don't really follow Tinder etiquette, but it's not like there aren't more problematic portraits of the Queen to use. In Australia, we also recently updated our $5 note, and we also kept the Queen's portrait pretty much the same. Older than England's, but younger than New Zealand's. And we kind of stuck her under some 7-Eleven lighting as well. It's, a bit of a boost in graphics. We also shifted her gaze slightly to look directly at the person holding the banknote. It only took the Queen 24 years to make eye contact. That beats my record. But doesn't she seem so much more trustworthy now? What else has changed? She's also lost her giant crown and her weird royal dress thingy. Now she's just wearing earrings and a necklace. Elizabeth's face has gotten bigger, but the royal trappings have become a lot more inconspicuous. A pretty clever adaptation for a country whose relationship with the royals is now more about admiring and looking up to the individuals in the family, rather than worshipping the monarchy as an institution. It's also about as far as you can get from something like the Armada portrait of the Queen's namesake, Elizabeth I, dressed up to the nines, military victories behind her, her hand enveloping the globe, inseparable from English power and glory. Since we went decimal in the 60s, the Queen has staked out her territory on the lowest denomination banknote. First the $1 note, then when that was decommissioned, she moved to the $5 note. You might think that this position could result in the Queen dropping off our notes altogether, but I wouldn't hold my breath. The combined efforts of Steve Waugh and Ray Martin couldn't dislodge the Queen or Parliament House from our $5 note. Sorry, Fred, you may have given Ray-Bans to a bunch of people or whatever it was you did, but the Queen is holding on to that $5 note like a vending machine at a Zone 2 train station. Putting her on a higher denomination note would generate resentment due to elevating her above other Australians, but removing her altogether might be a bit too Republican for our sensibilities. According to the Reserve Bank of Australia, it's customary for the sovereign to appear on the lowest denomination note, but again, like a lot of banknote etiquette, it's not really a rule that's written down anywhere. So I think the Queen is safe on our note for now. But since so much of our national attention is on the individuals of the royal family, rather than, as I said, on the monarchy as an abstract, it does raise the question of what will happen to our $5 note when the Queen dies. Buckingham Palace has already said that it's not very impressed with the popular Australian attitude of just waiting around for the Queen to die and then becoming a republic. They've sort of said that if we want that, we should just do it already. But I think we all know there's a good chance that that's how it's going to play out. The negative side of putting living people on banknotes is that living people are complicated. They mess up, they disappoint. The Queen has never once given a press interview, so she has the demeanour to pull off a kind of aloof, impenetrable regality. But her heirs have already been dragged down to our level in the tabloids. How would it feel having Charles on a banknote? Do you think he'd just slip into the background like the other people on our banknotes? Unnoticed, making up a part of our national identity that we absorb unthinkingly? Would our brains accept his portrait subconsciously, creating this Pavlovian connection between trust and value? Or would it snap us out of our reverie? Make us consider the absurdity of everything? You know, the monarchy, paper currency, all of it. Would it be like an airdropped banknote with a message on it? This is no different to a piece of paper. I think that absurdity was on display when the two sides of our $5 note came together in 1988. The Queen came to Australia that year to officially open our new Parliament House, and the leader of the opposition party, a starstruck young politician with luscious black locks called John Howard, referred to her as the pinnacle of our democracy. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about Parliament House. I mean, as you'd expect, it came in late and over budget, and the argument about where to build it got a little silly, with one member saying in Parliament that Jerusalem was built on a hill. Sodom and Gomorrah were the cities of the plain. But there are two things I will say about our new Parliament House building, as it's depicted on the $5 note. One is that rather than being plonked on top of the hill, it was dug into it. It was designed by the architect to blend seamlessly into the landscape. Two, the new Parliament House building is, well, it's new. It's actually slightly younger than I am. And yes, I did point out these two things in particular in order to make a tortured metaphor about banknotes. Like the Parliament House building, they're designed in a way that makes them melt into the landscape, as it were. And they're also not as old and established as you might assume. I mean, I, for one, assumed that they've kind of always been there. The British royal family is almost 1,000 years old, and the Bank of England is over 300 years old, so it never occurred to me that the reigning monarch has only been a feature of Bank of England notes since 1960. Banknotes are a national self-portrait, encapsulating a country's history, culture, and people. But, of course, a nation's identity isn't a fixed thing that you can just paint a picture of. It's something that's in a state of constant change. The banknotes of Fiji show the strain of keeping up with a rapidly changing national identity while trying at the same time to make that identity appear timeless and unwavering. Fiji became a republic in 1970, but its relationship with the Commonwealth is pretty all over the place. It was expelled from the Commonwealth in 87, readmitted in 97, then suspended in 2000, readmitted in 2001, suspended again in 2006, and then readmitted again in 2014. And in those years, throw in a couple of coups as well. But despite the fact that they had achieved independence years before, Queen Elizabeth II maintained a constant presence on Fijian paper money, right up until she was abruptly removed from their banknotes in 2012. It's fairly common for nations to outsource this kind of thing, so the Royal Australian Mint was responsible for making many of Fiji's coins. In a 1991 article about the Mint, the Canberra Times wrote that Fiji had placed an order for new coins featuring the Queen's profile, but they'd ordered that the coins be backdated to 1987, which was the year of the military coup. To me, that sums up everything. A new portrait on a piece of currency, backdated to appear like it had been there the whole time. Once a person appears on a banknote, it's like they've always been on the banknote. And when a country puts a person on a banknote to represent them as a nation, it's also a way of saying that that's what the nation's always been like. Around the world, there are bad people on banknotes. People who did terrible things, unforgivable things. But once their portrait is slapped on a piece of currency, their legacy is like a tumour that's been cut out. I'm not saying that these people are incapable of being critically re-examined, or that their actions didn't create legacies of injustice that still negatively impact people's lives today. Just that, for the most part, they're now seen as dormant. They belong to a vague idea of olden days. On the other side, there are people from marginalised groups who are chosen to represent countries on banknotes. In Australia, we have women and Indigenous people on banknotes, people who were the target of hatred and prejudice when they were alive. But put them on a banknote and it's like they've been posthumously accepted, incorporated into the country seamlessly, swallowed up by the whole. Their radical edges smoothed, their struggles sanitised. Their faces made passive and static, to stare out at us with glazed, unblinking eyes, as they circulate through a changing country forever and ever. Next episode, the $10 note. This one will be a lot more biographical about Mary Gilmore and Banjo Patterson, and a bit on Australia's literary tradition and socialism. Thanks for listening, hope you like and subscribe.